Okay, let's start. I'm very happy, or I think I am. I'm not sure anymore what I am or who is it, but my brain is happy, or makes me happy. That so many have found your way back here. There might even be more people today than yesterday, and if you missed yesterday's lecture, these are being recorded so you can see them online later. And it's my pleasure, again, I don't know, to invite Lisa back for the second lecture, which be about the mind. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So thanks for those of you who returned, and welcome to those of you for whom this is your first lecture with me. I want to start, first of all, by thanking you for yesterday. I really appreciated the way that you engaged with the material. I understand this is a really different way to think about things. And I was really happy. I know I was happy, yeah. I think in UK English, you would say I was chuffed. I was pleased that you had an open mind, and even when there were critical questions. So I just wanted to say that. I really appreciate the critical questions are necessary, and I really appreciated how yesterday, the vibe and the flow of yesterday. In yesterday's lecture, I introduced the hypothesis that your brain constructs emotion. And in today's lecture, I'm going to actually unpack a little bit of the neuroscience of how I think this works. Like yesterday, I will show you a little bit of data. At one point, we'll get a little intense, one image that's a little more detailed. But mostly, I'm going to be summarizing findings for you with images and illustrations, examples. And then the references, one or two references appear on the screen if you want the more scholarly or the more empirical references. And I'm also happy to provide additional ones. And I'll warn you before we get to the most intense neuroscience. I actually spent yesterday an hour making a new slide to talk about the anatomical details, and my husband was just shaking his head, going, "You're not going to have time for that." So if I don't, maybe we'll talk about it tomorrow or in the question and answer. So today we're going to start with this question: what is your brain's most important job? In psychology and in neuroscience, the traditional way to approach this question is to use common sense categories or folk psychology categories, types of thoughts, types of emotions, types of perceptions, types of actions. So psychologists and neuroscientists for really at least a century, if not longer, started with folk psychology categories as from the West, I should point out, as a formal ontology of the mind, what the mind is, and then mapped these categories to mental processes, what the mind does. So the assumption is that if you experience anger, then you have an anger process in your brain, and then correspondingly, some kind of dedicated set of neurons devoted to the process of anger. So folk categories are what the mind is, what the mind does, and how the mind is caused. And scientists spent really many decades and a lot of time and a lot of money searching for the physical basis of these categories. And in the history of psychology and in neuroscience, you can see the ebb and flow of scientists grappling with the fact that they haven't ever been able to identify the physical basis of any folk category sufficiently. That's a topic, I think, an interesting topic for another day. Today, what I want to suggest to you is that basically what scientists have been doing is starting with their because they're mostly Western scientists, right? Starting with their own subjective experiences and then going searching for the biological basis of those experiences in the human brain and in the brain of other animals. And what I'm going to suggest to you today is that I think a more scientifically sound approach is to go in the other direction. So in our lab, what we do is we start with questions like, how did a brain evolve? How does it develop? How is it structured? And then we ask, okay, given our ecology, what sort of mental events does a human brain create? How does it create them? And this approach, I think, leads us to think about the basic operating principles of the brain. I would say definitely of the human brain. I would go out as far on a limb to say a mammalian brain and maybe even to some extent a vertebrate brain in certain cases. So that's what we're going to do. And to do this, we have to first travel very far back in time, about 550 million years, give or take, to a world where the world was ruled by creatures without brains. Kind of like now. But back then, creatures didn't need brains. Like this little guy, the Amphioxus. The Amphioxus is very small. It's about 5 centimeters long. It has very few organ systems. It has no heart, no lungs, no oscillating GI system. It's basically a stomach on a stick. It virtually has no systems to sense the outside world. No eyes, no ears, no lateral line system. And also these little guys have no brains. But over evolutionary time, animals' bodies got larger and larger. These bodies had they developed internal visceral systems to coordinate and control. Systems that shuttle nutrients back and forth. Systems to get rid of waste. Animals also evolved new sensory systems. They evolved eyes and a visual system. They evolved a lateral line system to sense the world around them. And these were distance senses that perturbed those inner systems. And so as bodies became more complicated, they needed a central command center to coordinate them efficiently. And that is what a brain is. So your brain's most important job is coordinating and regulating the many, many organs and tissues of your body. So if you consider that right now, as you listen to this talk, and I know you're sitting here in rapt attention, your brain is actually regulating your very, very complicated body. It's supervising over 600 muscles. It's balancing dozens of hormones that are coursing through your blood, which is pumping at about 4 to 5 liters a minute. At the same time, it's regulating the energy of billions of cells. It's directing your GI system as it digests food. It's coordinating your kidneys and your liver as they excrete waste, and your lungs also. It coordinates your immune system as it fights illness. And largely speaking, you are unaware of all this drama. I hope, for your sake, you are unaware of all this drama. The name for this drama is allostasis. How many of you have heard the word allostasis before? Oh, wow. Okay, that's a lot. Well, allostasis is about efficient energy regulation at all levels of output. So metabolism can be efficient when you're sleeping, and it can be efficient when you're running a kilometer. But maybe when you're running a kilometer. I think for me now, when I'm running a kilometer, I'm probably not in allostatic balance. But this is not to be confused with homeostasis. How many of you have heard of homeostasis? Yeah, okay. So homeostasis is about regulating back to a set point. In allostasis, there are no set points, and the regulation is predictive, whereas in homeostasis, it's reactive. So the point that I want to make here is that there are certain systems in your body that work by homeostasis, like temperature regulation. Your temperature has to be regulated within a certain set of boundaries or you'll die. But those systems that work by homeostasis all have to be coordinated by the brain's allostatic efforts. Now, allostasis has been linked to the metabolic costs of signaling, of electrical signaling, by Peter Sterling, the physiologist Peter Sterling and Simon Laughlin, in a really great book called The Principles of Neural Design. And they define allostasis as the core task of all brains, which is to regulate the organism's internal milieu, just means your organ systems and viscera and so on, by anticipating the needs of the body and preparing to meet those needs before they arise. When I'm talking to the public, to civilians, I like to use the metaphor of running a budget for your body. Your brain is running a budget for your body. Your brain is budgeting water and salt and oxygen and glucose and other resources as you lose and gain them. Now, this is a metaphor. All metaphors in science are wrong, but some metaphors are useful. And I think this is a useful metaphor for a number of reasons. So I'm just going to lay out the metaphor for you. So anything that replenishes resources like eating and sleeping, you can think about like deposits in your body budget. Anything that spends resources is like a withdrawal. So for example, just simply your heart beating is a withdrawal. Dragging your ass out of bed in the morning, definitely a withdrawal. Your immune system protecting you from illnesses like, from viruses like COVID, very big withdrawal. The vertebrate immune system is adaptive, meaning it's a system that learns. It's very, very, very expensive system, metabolically speaking. And actually learning in general is also more metabolically expensive. Anything which makes your budgeting more efficient, like support from a loved one or a friend, is like a savings. And anything that makes your budgeting less efficient, like social stress or loneliness, is like paying a little tax. And just to give you one example, this is from Janice Kiekolt-Glaser. If you experience social stress within 2 hours of eating a meal, your metabolism is less efficient to the tune of 104 calories. It's as if you ate 104 calories more than you actually did, which if you add that up over a year of meals, that's 11 pounds. That means if you do what I do, which is read the newspaper in the morning while you're having breakfast, which you should not do, if you're exposed to social stress, if you experience stress over the course of a year, you could eat exactly the same food, do exactly the same amount of exercise, and actually gain weight. So the point is that the taxes are very small in any given instance, but they add up over time. They can add up over time. So your brain is always guessing when to spend resources and when to save them, and it's tuning its budgeting efforts along the way. And this guessing when to spend and when to save, we have a fancy name for that in science. We call it decision making. That's what decision making is. Correspondingly, the brain, as it's regulating and coordinating the systems of your body, it's also modeling the sensory consequences of those changes, which is called interoception. Now, some people think interoception is your awareness of your physical sensations, like how aware are you of your heart beating in your chest? But that's not, interoception is not about awareness. Interoception is the brain's modeling of the sensory changes that result from allostasis. And it supports allostasis in the same way as somatosensory signals for touch and proprioception and so on support skeletal motor control. So interoception is really about modeling the sensory conditions of the body. And your mood, or what scientists like me call affect, is linked to interoception. It's affect is like a general barometer. So interoception is very high it's got lots and lots and lots and lots of little signals, very high in dimensionality, the signals. But your brain compresses these signals and summarizes them into simple feelings that manifest as feeling pleasant or feeling unpleasant, feeling worked up, feeling calm, feeling comfortable, uncomfortable, and so on. So mood is like a quick and dirty summary of your allostatic status without much detail. So affect, mood, is not emotion. Because your brain is always regulating your body and it's always modeling the sensory consequences of that regulation, mood is always with you every moment of your life, whether you're emotional or not. So affect is a property of consciousness, even when you're not emotional and even when these features are not in the forefront of your awareness. So when you're feeling pretty good, allostasis is probably going pretty well. And when you're feeling like crap, when you're feeling dragged out, or when you're feeling distressed, allostasis is probably not going well in that moment. Now, it could be that something's happened out in the world that your brain has to anticipate and prepare for. But it's also possible that you're just doing something hard, which momentarily puts you out of allostatic balance. Anybody here working on a PhD or done a PhD? Yeah, okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Or learning how to play a sport, or learning how to paint, or learning how to acquire any skill. Feeling bad doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong. It could just mean you're doing something hard, and allostatically there's a cost to you, and you have to replenish what you've spent. It also could mean that you're just sleep deprived, or that you need some water, or you have to hydrate. The point that I'm trying to drive home here is that mood is it's a general indicator of allostatic status, but it doesn't have a lot of detail. It doesn't tell you what is wrong. It doesn't tell you what you have to do. It's just an indication that metabolically something is, it gives you a report basically of your metabolic status. So this is the point where we're going to, one of the points in the talk where we're going to dive into a bit of data. And I'm going to show you some brain images, and I'm going to walk you through what they mean. So in our lab, we identified the brain architecture that is responsible for allostasis, for interoception, and for affect. And here it is, and I'm depicting it in 3 parts. So what I've done is I've taken a brain and I've cracked it open like a book. We talked about this yesterday. And you're looking at the middle page, or a medial view of the brain. And this system, this is a unified single system, but I've broken it into 3 parts for reasons that will become apparent in a minute. The colored blobs here reflect connectivity, not bold signals. It's not like the magnitude of bold signal. This reflects the signals that are fluctuating with each other in sync. They're correlated. So this, you can think of this as functional connectivity between brain regions. The one in red and the one in purple are they reflect 2 networks that are in the anatomical connections of your brain. So they're called intrinsic networks. And they overlap in those green areas. Now this is the system that regulates your autonomic nervous system, so your heart, your lungs, your gut, and so on. It regulates your immune system and metabolism. This system is widely distributed throughout the cerebral cortex and also contains many clumps of neurons in subcortical areas. And I should also point out that even though this is a brain imaging study, all of these connections that are depicted with these colored blobs actually have been verified in anatomical studies of macaques. So these are real connections. As far as if you count by real, what you mean by real are biological connections that have been verified in track tracing studies in animals. This system includes the hippocampus. What I'm showing you here is a side view of the longitudinal axis of the hippocampus. The hippocampus, scientists have thought for a long time, is specialized for memory. But the hippocampus has more endocrine receptors than any other brain region in your entire brain except the hypothalamus, to which it is connected. So the hippocampus, whatever it's doing with respect to memory, it is a key regulator of your metabolism and the coordination of the systems in your body. This system also includes the cerebellum. So I'm showing you a cross section here of the cerebellum, but this is your cerebellum here. The cerebellum, scientists for many years believed was specialized for controlling skeletal-motor control, but actually it evolved in fish as a sensory for sensory regulation. Now, are there any neuroscientists in the room here? Okay, well, this is for you. So the intrinsic networks that we identified. So we actually didn't go looking for these networks. The study was designed to identify the regions that were important for allostasis. But what we found were two intrinsic networks that have many different names because neuroscientists like to name things in line with what they're interested in. But they often go by the name default mode and salience networks. And they overlap in these green regions, which are considered to be part of the backbone of neural communication in the brain. So there are hubs in your brain that are responsible for coordinating signaling throughout the brain, which is thought to be related to consciousness. And key parts of the brain that regulate your body are part of that coordination, or part of those hubs. So those hubs are part of the network, I should say. Now, these two networks, while they're regulating your body in every moment of your life, are also involved in creating a multitude of psychological phenomena, as you can see here. This is a summary of 6,000 published brain imaging studies. And findings like this reinforce, again, the observation that folk psychological categories don't have dedicated parts. Now, I'm going to give you one example. So this is the second. I'm not really going to show you data. I'm just going to show you a brain image to illustrate a brain region that we're going to talk about for a second. To understand why this is a really significant departure from what other scientists do and why we think it's important, we're going to focus on a structure in the midbrain called the periaqueductal gray, or the PAG. So the PAG is supposed to contain fight or flight circuits that get activated when you are exposed to a threat. Has anyone heard of fight or flight circuits here? Has anyone heard that you have a reptilian brain? You have a lizard brain? Okay, this is part of your so-called lizard brain. You don't really have a lizard brain, actually. The only animal who has a lizard brain is a lizard, honestly, because mammals didn't evolve from lizards. Lizards and mammals evolved from fish, but I digress. The PAG is supposed to contain fight or flight circuits that are active that become triggered whenever you face threat. Now, the PAG is it's a small cylinder that surrounds a part of the brain called the cerebral aqueduct, and it's extremely hard to study in humans, in live humans, with standard imaging procedures. So you have to use very, very high resolution imaging, which is, I'm showing you an image here from high resolution imaging. So instead of using a standard 3 Tesla magnet, we used a 7 Tesla magnet. This magnet is so powerful that when subjects are magnetically powerful, that when subjects are laying flat on a bed and we move them into the bore of the magnet, they sometimes become a little queasy. Like, it's just a super powerful magnet. And so, we have to give them a minute to kind of rest before we begin our experiments. And luckily, they have about 10 or 15 minutes to do that before the first experiment begins. And so now the PAG is part of that system that I showed you. So our hypothesis was that the PAG is not for fight and flight. It's for regulating its most basic function is to regulate your autonomic nervous system, which is probably driven really hard in threat. But it's not for threat per se. And to do this, to test this hypothesis, while we were scanning subjects, we gave them a very standard working memory task called an NBAC task. Has anyone heard of an NBAC task here? Okay, for those of you who haven't, I'm going to show you just how utterly trivial this task is. Absolutely trivial task. So on a given trial, subjects see a letter. Then on the next trial, they see another letter. And we say, is this the same or different than the last trial? Same or different? Same or different? There you go. That's it. That's called a one-back. We also gave subjects a three-back, where they had to hold the letter in mind for 2 trials to indicate whether it was the same or different than the upcoming trial. But whether it's a 1-back or a 3-back, both of these tasks are more trivial than remembering a phone number. So I'm just going to refer now to the findings from the 1-back task. What we found was, and I'm not going to, we don't have time for me to really go through the details, although I have the details if you want to see them. It's a beautiful study. The anatomy was worked out by one of our former postdocs, who's just a brilliant guy named Jordan Terrio, who's actually joining our lab as a director soon. But the point here is that this task, this 1-back task, modulated the bold signal in the PAG. And it changed people's breathing, and it changed their heart rate, breathing rate and heart rate. So findings like these suggest that the PAG is not for fight or flight. It doesn't contain circuits for fight or flight. It contains circuits that regulate your autonomic nervous system, which are driven really hard in threat. But that's not what they're for. It's kind of like cortisol. Cortisol, not a stress hormone, people. It's not a stress hormone. It's a hormone that that allows cell to metabolize glucose more easily, that happens to be secreted in stress. Because what is stress? It's a moment where your brain is predicting that your body will have a big metabolic outlay in the next moment. That's it. So yes, it's secreted during stress. It's also secreted when you get up in the morning right before you get out of bed. Okay, so these neurons are for body budgeting, for allostasis. And so here's the first insight, that your brain's regulation of your body is at the core of brain structure and function, and therefore it's at the core of your mind. So your brain's most important job is not thinking. It's not feeling. It's not seeing or hearing or sensing in any way. Your brain's most important job is regulating your very, very, very complicated body. And everything your brain does, psychologically speaking, is in the service of regulating that body. Now, for the most part, the body has been largely ignored in psychology and in the psychological and neuroscience study of the mind, because frankly, we're just unaware of all the drama going on in here. And we're not really wired to be aware of the high dimensional detail of the changes in our bodies. So if vision is like, if the analogy to vision is like a high dimensional, like high definition television, with a ton of detail, then interoception is like a 1950s black and white television set with a really bad antenna in the rain. We're not wired for the brain is tracking those details, but it doesn't make itself aware of those details. Now, of course, we don't experience every thought we have, every feeling we have, every hug we give, every insult we bear. We don't experience these things as having anything to do with our bodies, but under the hood, that is what is happening. And so what that means is that if we want to understand how a brain creates mental features, how a brain regulates motor actions, how a brain decides, then we have to understand the regulation of the body, because skeletal motor movement, for example, can't occur without the regulation of the visceral motor movements. Visceral motor movements are required to move your body to make actions. And I think another implication here is that the boundaries that separate mental from physical, just like cognitive from emotional, these boundaries were created by us. They weren't discovered by us. And they're really illusory in some ways and unhelpful. So now we're going to move from where allostasis is happening to how the brain might achieve allostasis. And to remind you, allostasis is defined as the predictive regulation of the body, because it turns out that the most efficient way to regulate a body and create a mind is to predict the body's needs in advance and correct those predictions when necessary. This comes directly from systems work in engineering. Now, there's a broad, very broad growing research tradition that has emerged in the last decade, kind of focused on understanding how a brain predicts. And there are literally, at this point, more than 1,000 papers. And, not all the details are worked out, and scientists don't agree on all the nitty-gritty little details. But what I'm going to do here is present you with a gist, like kind of the 20,000 meter summary with my own particular theoretical twist. So this is the general idea for how prediction works. Your actions and your experiences begin as memories that are similar to the present in some way. Of course, you're not aware of remembering anything, but this is actually what's happening. Your brain is re-implementing signals from the past that are similar to the present in some way. In psychology, things that are similar to each other, a group of things which are similar to each other, are called a category. So prediction signals are categories. Basically, your brain is a category generator. It's when it's predicting, it's constructing a category of possible futures. It's using the past and generalizing from the past to predict the immediate future, which will become your present. And these predictions are continually tested against the signals that are coming from your body and from the world. So here's one example of an experiment. Not my experiment, but so cool. I love this experiment. So just think about the last time you were thirsty and you drank a glass of water. Within seconds of draining the last drops, you probably felt less thirsty. But here's the interesting thing. It actually takes 20 minutes for water to reach your blood and for the associated signals to reach your brain, to tell your brain that you are no longer dehydrated. So that means that your thirst is being quenched 20 minutes too early. How does that happen? Well, it happens because your brain is a pattern learner. And over your lifetime, it's had thousands of opportunities to learn that certain actions involved in drinking and swallowing and certain and the taste and feel of water in your mouth eventually stops your feelings of thirst. Eventually stops the need for additional hydration. To get an intuition for how these prediction signals work, I want us to take a look at this movie. I'll wager that nobody in this room has ever seen electrical towers playing jump rope in real life. But hopefully you understand that's what's happening here. So how is your brain doing it? Well, this is an illustration that your brain can take bits and pieces of your past experience and combine them in novel ways to make sense of the visual signals that hit your retina coming from this screen. This is exactly what the brain does every time it creates a prediction signal. This is actually called conceptual combination in cognitive science. Cognitive scientists believe that conceptual combination is one of the most powerful capacities of the human brain. But this movie also illustrates something else that's really important about prediction signals. So, can anybody feel the thud of the towers as they hit the ground? Can anyone actually hear the towers hitting the ground? Yeah, I can hear them too. So, here's the really cool thing. On the basis of visual input only, using a lifetime of past experience with statistical regularities in the world, your brain is guessing at what the other sensory signals are likely to be. It's predicting vibrations that would be detected by your cochlea and by the somatosensory sensors in your somatosensory system, in your skin, for example, and in your bones. And essentially, if you experience any sort of vibration here, it's because your brain is changing the firing of its own neurons, its own sensory neurons, in the absence of these sensory signals, to start creating your experience before those signals arrive. That's what prediction signals are. They're not abstract, like amodal, propositional things. They are physical. They're embodied, essentially. This is also a demonstration of embodied concepts in action. This is what your brain is doing. It's beginning to assemble your experience before the sensory inputs come from the sensory surfaces of the body based on the pattern, the partial pattern that's available. Now I'm going to show you, so normally this is where I would stop, but recently I would stop with the examples and I would move on, but recently I came across this example on TikTok and that my daughter alerted me to, and I just thought it was so cool. It's so cool. I don't want to build it up too much, but I think it's really cool. So I'm going to show it to you because I think it makes a really good point. So this is a traffic light. I got really nervous when I first got here. I actually first got to Denmark and I saw some traffic lights and they only had 2 lights and I was like, shit, this is going to wreck my whole, but then I saw some with 3, so I was very happy. So just do me the courtesy and tell me, what colors do you see there? Come on, you can do it. Just shout it out. Thanks. Red? Yellow? Yeah, it should be green, but it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant for this example. It's supposed to be green. Okay. All right. Now, here are the lights again, this time with a filter over them. Now, who sees that top light as red? Yeah, okay. Here's a really cool thing. This experience, if you're having an experience of red, it's right now because your brain is remembering red. These are prediction signals. You know how I know these are prediction signals? Does anyone know? Yeah, this is a cyan filter, and it blocks out it filters out all of the wavelengths that a neurotypical retina people with neurotypical retinas will perceive as red. I should have asked this question. Does anyone here not have a neurotypical retina? Phew. Okay. Oh, you do? No? Can you see red? Okay. Oh, that's cool. We should talk afterwards. All right. So you're remembering red because really this is the actual wavelengths here are wavelengths that people with neurotypical retinas perceive as gray. This is a prediction signal. This is also what we would call an embodied concept. Okay, now here's a really ironic part from my perspective. And I'm just going to show you one more brain image, so just bear with me. Hopefully you'll find the punchline as cool as I do. So you remember that system that we talked about a few minutes ago, the one that regulates your body as it controls your actions and creates your thoughts and feelings and perceptions and so on. Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show it to you again. I'm going to show you one hemisphere of your cerebral cortex. Your cerebral cortex, one hemisphere is kind of like a balloon. And so I'm going to pop the balloon and I'm going to lay it flat so you can see the whole thing as a flat map. So that's this flat map of one hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. And what I've done is I've taken that allostatic system and I've colored it in yellow and orange and red. The hole in the middle there is where the subcortical areas would be. Okay. Now, who here has heard that your brain contains a limbic system? Okay. It's supposed to be the most reactive part of your brain that has to be controlled by rational cognition, right? The term limbic actually has a really interesting history. It was coined by the physician Paul Broca in the 19th century to describe the parts of the brain that border the subcortical areas. Limbic actually, it's the definition of that word means border. And so the border of the limbic areas of the cerebral cortex that border the subcortical parts of the brain include the cingulate cortex. You don't really need to care about these. Well, you probably care, you guys who are neuroscientists, but basically there are some parts that are considered to be limbic as an anatomical designation, right? When Broca used this term, he used it as an anatomical designation. And then over time, it became a functional one. People started using it functionally to mean the most emotional reactive parts of your brain. But we're going to use it for its anatomical designation to mean the parts of the brain that border, the parts of the cortex that border the subcortical regions, where there's a whole matrix of midbrain and brainstem nuclei, clumps of neurons that are important for regulating the body. So here's the irony. There's more than 30 years of published research with non-human animals which show that limbic regions are the most powerful predicting regions in the cerebral cortex. They are not reactive and in need of control. They are predicting and doing the control. They are at the top of what neuroscientists refer to as a functional hierarchy for prediction by virtue of their anatomy, the arrangement of the neurons in the cerebral cortex and their connections with each other. They are allostatically regulating your body 24/7. They control all of your physical movements along with your motor cortex and the premotor areas of your brain. So these regions are important they are the beginning of anytime there's a set of prediction signals that is issued, they are basically at the beginning of that volley of signals. So they're the source of the allostatic control signals that go to the body, and they are copies of those signals, literal copies of those signals, traverse the cortex to become sensory prediction signals, like the ones that we just experienced a a couple of moments ago. So the specific and I should mention that there is no limbic system, okay? Actually, I think that when there's a persistent allostatic problem in the brain, those limbic regions of the cortex do tend to hang together more than they do in neurotypically. And that is probably when they might even look like a system. But normally they are distributed throughout various intrinsic networks in the brain, and they themselves don't form a system, not in the traditional sense that we think of. So the specific hypothesis is that the first volley of signals in category construction are allostatic control signals from that limbic ring. And these signals move down the anatomical gradient from the midbrain to the brainstem to the spinal cord, where they become very specific signals for very specific movements that regulate your heart and your lungs and other visceral organs and tissues in your body. And at the same time, copies of these signals from collaterals off the main axons send signals along a cortical gradient as sensory prediction signals. And so if you think about what this means, it's actually something really cool. It means that, as I was saying yesterday, that a single signal, a neuron could be sending, like say in cingulate cortex, could be sending a signal from its main axon down into the brainstem. We would think of that as a visceromotor signal. And at the same time, a collateral comes off that axon and goes to V1. And so we would think of that as a sensory prediction signal. So the meaning of the signal depends on where it started and where it's going, who receives it. It's relational. It's not embedded in the neuron itself. And as predicted, I actually am not going to have time to show you the really other, I was going to sort of dig a little bit deeper into the anatomy, but maybe we'll have time for that tomorrow. For now, I'll just summarize here and say, so your brain is constructing your experience, what you see, what you hear, what you feel, as it predictively controls the inner systems of your body. It's coordinating and regulating those systems which support the skeletal-motor movements of your body, the actions that you take. So what this means is that experiences don't cause actions. You don't perceive something and then process it and then react to it with an action. The way it's working in the brain, according to predictive processing, according to our best understanding of predictive processing, is that the brain is generating action plans that start as visceromotor plans and eventually skeletal motor plans 15, 20 milliseconds later. And the consequence of those action plans is your experience of what's happening in the moment. There's a whole separate conversation we could have about stimulus response designs of experiments and why they are absolutely ill-advised. And I say this as someone who spent 25 years designing and running those experiments like everybody else. But they are breaking the natural contingency, but spatial temporal contingencies of signals in the predictive functioning of the brain. So there's a whole conversation to be had about the replication crisis in psychology and what it means that we're running experiments that are ill-suited to the ecology of how a brain actually functions. But again, that will be for another day. The third point that I want to make today is that the implication here is that the meaning of events that are outside your head, meaning in the world and even in your own body, derives in part from the prediction signals inside your head. And for the most part, your brain doesn't actually make itself aware of that ongoing dynamic. So predictions are happening continuously and they're happening automatically. They're so fast, you're not aware of them. Your brain does not make itself aware. So I'm going to give you a specially constructed experience to give you an intuition for how this works. So I want you to take a look at this image. Right now, billions of neurons in your brain are trying to make guesses to make sense of the visual signals coming off this image. So if I had your head in a brain scanner right now, your amygdala would be going nuts. Your brain is searching through a lifetime of past experiences, issuing thousands of guesses at once, weighing probabilities, trying to answer the question, what is this most like? Not what is it, but what is this most similar to, right? Because brains are, they construct categories as prediction signals. Now, if you're only seeing black and white blobs, then your brain hasn't found a good match yet, and you're in a state that philosophers call experiential blindness. And now comes my favorite part of the talk. Who would like me to cure you of your blindness? No, come on. In the United States, there are preachers, right? They get up, they're like, I'm going to cure you. Do you want to be cured? Yes. Can I get an amen? It's so much fun to do this in the States. You guys did a great job. Good job. Okay, so here we go. So it's a bee. And you can see the bee has antennas here, and it has a shiny head, and it's got shiny wings and a furry little bum. It's got some legs, right? Okay. So now who sees a bee or part of a bee? Okay. No. Well, we have a couple of no predictive signal. Okay. Do you want me to see it again? Okay. People often have an easier time with the head here and the wings here and the antenna, this antenna here. Anyways, if you see a bee now or part of a bee, it's because, this image hasn't changed from when I showed it to you a moment ago. You've changed, right? You now have new past experience that you didn't have before, thanks to the color photograph that I showed you. And there actually is no bee present here. Your predictions are filling in the lines to make you see a bee. So here's the way to think about it. Your body has many, many, many sensory surfaces. Some of those surfaces detect signals that are coming from the world, like the surfaces in your retina of each eye, the cochlea of each ear. You also have sensory surfaces inside your body that monitor the angle and tension of your joints and your tendons, that monitor oxygen and carbon dioxide changes, that monitor your temperature and how much glucose your cells are using, and so on and so forth. In predictive processing models, scientists, when they're using these models, they like to say that the brain is running a model of the world. The brain is not running a model of the world. The brain is running a model of the sensory surfaces of your body. V1 doesn't model the world, it models your retina. Right? A1, primary auditory cortex, doesn't model the world, it models your cochlea. Your brain is running a model of the sensory surfaces of your body. These physical signals are constantly streaming to your brain. On their own, they have no inherent psychological meaning. We just experienced that with the blobby bee. They become meaningful as prediction signals. They become meaningful as they meet prediction signals that are already present in your brain. So let me say a little bit more about that. Your brain is trapped in a dark, silent box called your skull. And it's receiving these sensory signals from the sensory surfaces of your body. But these signals are the outcomes of some set of changes. But your brain doesn't know what the change is. It doesn't know the causes of the signal. It only knows the signals, which are the outcomes. So if you hear a loud bang, that loud bang could be a car door slamming. It could be thunder. It could be, if you're in the United States, a gunshot. You laugh, but not, I mean, you know how many school shootings there were in the United States last year? 240. Yeah. Exactly. The first time you hear a gunshot, I'm from Canada, so I didn't even see a gun until I was, 27 years old, and I moved to the United States. In a Walmart, I saw guns. That was my first time ever seeing a gun, like, in person. When you hear a gunshot, you don't know what it is. You have to learn what it is. How do you learn? You learn by requiring statistical patterns. So when there's a loud bang, your brain doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know how to prepare action to keep you alive. It has to guess. Receiving an outcome and not knowing the cause and having to guess at the cause, that's called an inverse problem or a reverse inference problem. How does the brain solve that problem? It solves that problem by using past experience that's similar to the present. It's making guesses. So the signals themselves have no inherent psychological meaning. Your brain makes them meaningful in conjunction with its own prediction signals. When the incoming sensory signals match, the pattern matches the predictions, then the signals are categorized and explained. If they don't match, then your brain has an opportunity to adjust. And we have a fancy name for that adjustment. We call it learning. The brain encodes the unexpected signal patterns, and now those become available for the next time the brain is going to predict. These ideas are really unintuitive, so I'm gonna just describe them again in a slightly different way. So your brain is always controlling the movements inside your body with allostatic control signals which are necessary for the skeletal movements of your body. And it's always predicting the sensory consequences of those movements, what you will see next and hear next and feel next, and everything that you'll experience in the next moment based on the visceromotor and the predicted visceromotor and skeletal movements. Then at the same time, it's receiving sensory signals from the sensory surfaces, which, if they match, then the predictions manifest as your actions and your experience of yourself in the world. And those actions and experiences are explained. This is how a scowl can be an expression of anger or an expression of concentration or what have you. If the signals don't match, then your brain has an opportunity to resolve the difference. It doesn't always, but it has the opportunity to do that, to take in the signal pattern that was unexpected, which is what scientists call prediction error. And then the process continues. And the whole thing is happening automatically outside of your awareness for the most part throughout your entire life. So category construction, your brain as a category constructor is a meaning maker. Your brain starts with a category of possible futures and ends with a specific instance of action and mental features that are meaningful as something, right? So categories aren't out there in the world with concepts in your head. Your brain is generating categories, or you could call them concepts, or you could call them conceptual categories, or you could call them ad hoc concepts. They all mean the same thing. Your brain starts with a category and it ends with an instance. And I'm just giving you a gist level summary here, but this is what I think of as the most basic operating principle of the brain. Most of the major topics in psychology are about meaning making, and I think that they can all be subsumed under this predictive processing framework where we understand meaning making as category construction, which unites different folk categories into a common framework, a common computational framework for meaning making in the service of energy regulation. So every action you take, every experience you have is some combination of the remembered past as prediction signals that are constraining and giving meaning to the sensory present, the incoming sensory signals from the sensory surfaces of your body. And for the most part, your brain doesn't make itself aware of this ongoing dynamic. This is the relational view of meaning. The psychological meaning of physical signals is not in the signals themselves. Like we saw yesterday, faces don't broadcast emotion. Bodily changes are not inherently emotional. The firing of a single neuron has no intrinsic psychological meaning. That meaning is a function of relations between other signals, between that signal and other signals. So physical signals like these become psychologically meaningful only in relation to other physical signals, particularly the signals that exist only in your brain. And tomorrow, in lesson 3, we're going to consider what these ideas mean for the nature of reality. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and take questions.
First question from Peter.
Thank you for a very clear talk. Many of the models you describe, I mean, the allostatic processes, people from control theory would describe them as feed-forward models.
Yes, yes.
And I suppose there are a lot of things related to that. But what I find most interesting is this idea of category construction. So could you say something about how feed-forward models would combine with these ideas of category construction?
Yes, I can. So I will say that we've been having an ongoing conversation in our lab. So I am very fortunate to work with a group of engineers for about more than a decade now, I would say. And so we've been having a conversation that probably spans, I don't know how many years at this point, about whether we want to understand this architecture as predictive or whether we want to understand it in terms of optimal control theory. So as a control theory framing, you would say, the way we think about it, if I was to translate this, so predictive processing is about the control of the motor movements, the visceromotor movements. From a control theory standpoint, we would think of this as an attempt to control the inputs to the system, which are going to perturb the system. So you're attempting to reduce the perturbation and not so much reduce the cost to zero, but make the cost as efficiently executed as possible. So unlike other predictive processing models, we're not saying people are trying to reduce prediction error. Living organisms can't do that. But what they can do is try to control the inputs to the system to reduce or improve the efficiency of what they're spending, right? So I'm trying to think of, because of course what I really want to do is just show you that image that I spent an hour on that I haven't. And I'm trying to think, is that going to answer your question? Maybe I could show it to you. Yeah, I think the way to think about it. Well, let me just ask first, did that answer your question or not really?
Not really. Not the part about what the category construction plays for, what the role of category construction is in feed-forward modeling.
Yeah. Let me think about how to. Does everyone know what feed-forward modeling is? Okay. Yeah, I don't have a slide for that, so it's not going to be easy for me to explain. Give me 1 second to think about it. No, just give me 1 second. Seriously, like, just give me a second to think about it. So, when I'm just going to say it, and then I'll figure out later if I need that slide. So when your brain is constructing a category, it starts as multimodal compressed summaries, basically, in parts of the brain. I am just going to talk about this image now. I'll just talk about it, and I'll show it to you tomorrow. It starts with multimodal compressed summary. So if you pop the top off the cerebral cortex, you pop the cortex off the rest of the brain, you stretch it out like a napkin, there's an architectural gradient, compression gradient there. That's just one. There are a bunch of compression gradients in the brain. So in V1, for example, you've got a lot of tiny little neurons. They're coding for their receptive fields are for angles and edges and lines and things, really high dimensional, tiny little details. That's true for all of the exteroceptive sensory systems. And then the neurons send signals that you're reducing spatial temporal redundancies again and again and again. So the neurons are becoming larger and larger and larger and larger with more connections, fewer neurons. So you're basically compressing like an MP3 until you get these multimodal summaries in limbic areas. So these big neurons. And this is what we think of as mental features, basically. So that's where predictions begin. They begin as mental features, abstract features. By abstract, I don't mean amodal, I mean multimodal summary that can decompress into a bunch of different possible sensory motor particulars. And the sensory signals that are coming from the sensory surfaces are basically helping to select which set of prediction signals is the correct one. Now, I could also describe this in a different way. I could say, you know what, the brain is constantly associating, and the incoming sensory signals from the surfaces, which are the feed-forward signals, are constraining where the brain can go next. It's constraining those predictions, which is why an analogy, or maybe not an analogy, but a way to think about it is like with psilocybin and LSD. One way to explain what's happening is those drugs are interfering with the body's constraining of the trajectory of the brain. So you could actually think about the incoming signals from the world and from the body, according to those sensory surfaces, as constraining where the brain goes next. So the category construction is sort of the next moment of category construction is constrained by the signals.
This is saying that the multimodal summaries generate a limited set of variables that the feed-forward models can work with.
Yeah, I need to write that down. That was like a really good summary. Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, exactly. And we kind of we're really going back and forth about, I think we've decided to take kind of a pluralistic approach here. And sometimes it's very useful to think about prediction and feedback as the driver, and sometimes it's really useful to think about the incoming sensory signals and feed-forward signaling as the drivers. I think it just depends on what you're trying to explain. But I think one thing that's very important to understand is that you could even model the whole thing at the body and the brain as a system if you wanted to, as opposed to thinking about the sensory surfaces as inputs to the system. You could also think about a dyad as a system. You could think about you decide where you place the boundaries of your system and what's an input to it and what's an output. Thankfully, I think we got your comment on tape. So I'll be able to attribute it to you. When I use it next time somebody asks me that question, I'll just be able to give them a one-sentence answer, and off we go.
Peter, can you hand your microphone down there?
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
I have a quite general question. With this perspective in mind, how should I think around emotion regulation and the automatic and more effortful parts of emotion regulation, and maybe even around emotion dysregulation or problems with emotion regulation?
Well, I will say that, my good colleague James Gross and I, he's a good friend, and we've had an ongoing debate for many years about whether emotion construction and emotion regulation are exactly the same thing or are they different. And recently his lab just published a paper showing that actually there's no distinction in the signaling patterns in the brain for emotion, what he would call emotion generation and emotion regulation. I think of category construction as anticipatory regulation, basically. So that doesn't answer your question about why it sometimes feels effortful and why sometimes it doesn't. I don't think I have a really good answer for that question. I don't think we know. But I will say that if the brain is predicting and the incoming signals match the predictions, that is what we think of as automatic processing. And when there's prediction error that the brain has to expend energy to learn, that is what we think of as controlled processing. Because what's happening is the brain's taking in those prediction error signals, adjusting its predictions for the next, right? So it's adjusting itself to those incoming signals. It's probably better to think about that as control theory, from a control theory standpoint. But why do you feel a sense of effort when there is more metabolic cost? I don't know the answer to that question. We've just started to study questions having to do with the psychological, what are the psychological consequences of brain variations in brain metabolism, but I don't know the answer. I don't think anyone. That's a question of consciousness that I don't have the answer to. I don't think it's really useful to distinguish between the generation of emotion and the regulation of emotion. And as far as dysregulation goes, again, I will say, with respect to what goal? Like, what is this dysregulated relative to what? Like right? You can't, in this perspective, you can't ask a question in the absence of a relational context. So, do you mean that you're in that you're having mental features of emotion or actions that you would rather not, or that cause a problem, or that someone else doesn't want you to have, or you can't really answer the question without reference to a goal or a function.
Can you pass the mic backwards to Melina?
I'll just say, while we're passing, I'll just say one other thing, and that is, I think one thing that probably bears mentioning is that this perspective is a summary of a lot of work by a lot of people, but it also has some new elements to it. And oftentimes, the value of a new framework or summarizing things in a different way is that it leads us to ask different questions, right? Sometimes progress in science is not answering questions, it's asking better questions. And Thomas Kuhn made the point in his book on scientific revolutions that when there's a new paradigm that's introduced, we often hold it to the standard of wanting it to answer all the old paradigm's questions, plus already have the answers to all the new questions that it's asking. And I don't, so the way that ever since really Helmholtz, right? Controlled processing has been defined subjectively, a subjective sense of effort, a subjective sense of control. Those are questions of consciousness, and we don't know the answers to those questions. But it places those questions, I think, in in maybe a more productive context. That's maybe the way to say it. Yeah.
All right.
There was a question.
Yeah, over here. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. And I think maybe it relates to your last point here, what you were just saying, but I'll ask it anyway. So I was wondering, and I'm not really sure how you said that your account doesn't really take into account predictive error minimization.
Oh, well, what I said, I'm not talking about the prediction error part, but what I would say is that the goal isn't to reduce prediction error. Just to clarify before you ask your question, it's not to reduce prediction error. So we're not subject to this dark room problem the way that the other. But now please.
Okay, maybe that if I think about it a bit more, maybe my question is unnecessary. But maybe you could say something more about just self-deception and how that would work. So I'm thinking if the brain did that to the body, self-decept itself. It would be devastating, I imagine. But when it's psychologically, it seems to even be beneficial sometimes. So how would?
So I'm going to take apart your question a little bit and sort of separate it into two parts. So the brain can run a faulty model of the body. That's definitely what it's doing in chronic pain, and it's probably what it's also doing in certain cases of depression. Right, so the brain can believe there's a metabolic problem in the body when there is no problem. The brain can run a model that it's failed to update. That's what happens in chronic pain. In chronic pain, there was tissue damage somewhere. There were nociceptive signals that were being sent to the brain. The brain adjusted to those signals. You experience pain. Then the tissue heals, but the brain doesn't update its model. You continue to feel pain. There's no organic signaling, nociceptive signaling that's causing, that is the definition of chronic pain. We can speculate why that happens. In that case, I don't think the brain is deceiving itself. It's running a faulty model of the sensory surfaces of its body. And this sometimes also happens in depression. In depression, the brain believes that there is a metabolic problem in the body, and its predictions its allostatic control is trying to adjust for that. So this is work by, there's a lot of people's work showing that, in depression, a lot of the symptoms of depression are about minimizing metabolic cost, like fatigue and, so you don't move around very much and so on and so forth. And sometimes in depression, there is a real metabolic problem, and sometimes there was, and now there isn't, and the brain has failed to update itself because updating is expensive. But that's a whole very interesting set of questions there. But you're asking me, I think, about why a brain deceives itself. It makes it so that now you're asking me a question I can't answer. I don't know the answer to the question of how a brain makes itself aware of some features and not of others, why it would choose to do. I have no idea at all. I don't really understand, for example, why are we, why do we have experience? A brain creates experiences. The brain is a master of deception. It creates experiences that feel as if they reveal how the brain works when they don't. Why does that happen? I don't know the answer, but I think it's an interesting question to ask in a way that is not Cartesian. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I will say this, most of the time when people are deceiving, you feel like they're deceiving you, they're really just deceiving themselves in your presence. You're like the platform for them to perform themselves on. I don't know how predictive processing would account for that. I'm not saying it doesn't. I just think nobody's really asked that question to my knowledge, or I'm not aware of anybody who has.
Yep, please.
So thank you. I love listening to your constructing categories sort of on the spot, and it seems very radical for me to hear you say that you shouldn't distinguish. One shouldn't distinguish between emotion construction and emotion regulation. And my mind is reeling as I'm trying to grapple with that statement. Would you expand on that, maybe in the context of what you've written about previously about seeing mental illness, and you just touched on depression in terms of faulty body budgeting or energy budgeting?
Sure.
So please expand on that.
Sure.
Thank you.
So, of course, the process model of emotion regulation is based on the assumption that there are emotion circuits in your brain and they get triggered, and you can do something preemptively to avoid their trigger. That's one kind of regulation. And then you can adjust, you can reappraise and change the meaning of the stimulus that triggered the emotion after the fact. Basically, there are a bunch of other little distinctions, but that's the big one. I think that's just a way of describing emotion construction. You're just talking about the next moment where you're constructing something different. I think it all comes down to what you call a moment, like where are you putting the boundaries of an event. So I don't think that's very interesting. Personally, I think it's just very straightforward. And what I'm denying is that there are special processes in your brain called emotion regulation processes. I just don't think they exist. It's just you can account for the whole thing by one set of dynamics, one set of computational processes. But I think that what this perspective suggests about depression is very, very interesting. Basically, it's suggesting that the brain it's attempting to downregulate its spending because it believes there's a metabolic problem in the body. So maybe because there is something wrong with, maybe you have heart disease, maybe you have a problem with your mitochondria. I mean, that actually is both. Maybe you have diabetes, all of those illnesses are related to depression, right? And so scientists and physicians will ask questions like, how does having heart disease, cardiovascular disease, cause depression? Like, here's cardiovascular disease and it is causing some other thing to happen called depression. As opposed to saying, there's a metabolic problem and that metabolic problem is manifesting itself in multiple ways, and so in cardiovascular disease, we are defining the disease physically, and then we look at the mood consequences and we think of those as secondary. In depression, we look at the mood symptoms as primary and we look at the physical consequences as secondary. It's really, they're really two sides of the same coin. The interesting thing in depression, though, and so I'll just give this as the example. If you actually have a metabolic problem in your body, and you treat depression with an SSRI, serotonin, so you're using a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so you're trying to leave more serotonin in the synapses. Serotonin evolved as a metabolic regulator. It allows an animal to spend metabolically when there is no immediate reward in sight. So the animal isn't predicting an immediate reward, but it can forage for information anyways. That's what serotonin lets you do. It lets you continue to move and learn when there's no immediate deposit in sight. If you have an actual metabolic problem and you give someone an SSRI, that person has a problem, you give them an SSRI, that will improve their energy regulation for about a couple of months. And then the brain will adjust and downregulate again, and downregulate again, and downregulate again. You're basically driving an already a budget that's already in deficit into massive bankruptcy. So I think that one of the personally, my hypothesis would be one of the reasons we have high levels of untreatable depression, people who suffer with depression for years and years and years, is that they've been taking SSRIs inappropriately, or SNRIs. It doesn't really matter, because SSRIs don't just work on serotonin. They also work on norepinephrine, and SNRIs don't just work on norepinephrine. They also work, they're all monoamines. They're all very, very close together in the brain. I think that depression that results from an actual metabolic problem is very different from depression that results from a temporary problem where the brain didn't update its model, because updating is expensive. So that, if you give that person an SSRI, they can move around and forage for new information, for more prediction error, and they have the energy to update their model, and then they recover. So that's just one example, I think, of what, right? Or I would say another example would be, right now there are record levels. I don't know if it's true here, but certainly in the United States and in other places, there are record levels of depression in adolescents, depression, anxiety in adolescents. It's really at a epidemic level, I would say. I'm not the only one. The World Health Organization is now claiming that death and disability due to depression is actually higher than any other illness now in the world, including heart disease, which used to be number one. Adolescence is a metabolically fraught time, especially for girls, for boys too, but especially for girls, because the body is much more difficult to control during puberty. And so that's a metabolic load. And that metabolic load is happening at the same time as a bunch of other metabolic loads that happen during adolescence. So it's not that surprising from that perspective that we would be seeing this epidemic. It gives a different spin, I think, on why we might be seeing the mood-related problems that we're seeing. I could go on and on and on, but I'm not saying any of these explanations are true. I'm saying they're different ways of looking at a problem, and they provide a fresh, I think, set of questions. So I'll just say one last thing, just because I find it really interesting, so I'm sorry to go on and on, but Helen Mayberg is a neurologist in the United States, and she does deep brain stimulation of a particular part of the brain. These are for people who've had depression for many, many, many years, and they've not been able to be treated by anything. No drugs, no therapy, nothing works. They're very, very, very impaired. What the stimulation does is it increases the myelination in a tract that connects the part of the cingulate that is most important for regulating the body and the part of the cingulate which is most important for regulating the skeletal motor system. That suggests that intractable depression is a disconnection syndrome. You've got two motor systems. They have to be coordinated. If they're not coordinated, that's a tax. That's a drag on the system. So again, I would say, I don't know if this is the case. I do know from her that is the finding. It stimulates oligodendrocytes, which increases the myelination of the cingulum bundle. And that does connect those two motor systems together. Although they have some shared brain parts also. That's not the only way they're connected. But I just think it's a different way of thinking about things. Yeah. Ask new questions.
Jordan?
Thank you very much. I'll go on a much higher level, not on the level of mechanism that we just discussed or models of feed-forward prediction, etc., but on the level of perhaps even touching on the philosophical level. I missed, the class yesterday, and I'm not sure about tomorrow, but I anticipate, especially with the title about constructing reality, you're philosophically close to constructivism. And I know that has its own perils of subjectivism, etc. My question is actually more constructive. How do you feel about finding allies in people like Walter Freeman, Francisco Varela? Remember that book from 32 years ago, The Embodied Mind?
Oh, right, for sure. Yeah. So
they avoided to talking about constructing, but rather talk about enacting or bringing forth in world. So why not go that way rather than all the perils by evoking constructivism?
Because I think that, well, first of all, I think that what I'm suggesting is very consistent with embodied cognition, with enactment. I had a very long conversation with Michael Anderson, the philosopher Michael Anderson, because he wrote some papers on radical embodied cognitive neuroscience, where they were talking about neurons not representing, but what was the word he used? I can't remember the word he used. It was like a don't get old. It's bad. I'm having word finding problem. Like the neurons are like vibrating with. They're like resonating. Thank you so much. They're resonating. So I don't have a strong representational view with a capital R either. But I didn't understand, I don't understand resonating. I've never understood that. What exactly do you mean? So I asked him and he said, oh, you have to read this book. And he told me, so he directed me back to William James, actually a set of essays by William James that nobody appears to have heard of, although he thinks they're the most important essays he ever wrote, which gave rise to ecological psychology before Gibson, which inspired Gibson. So I guess from my perspective, I would say I think that this perspective is a realist perspective. It's constructivism is not in my hands is not idealism. It's relational realism. It's that, and I think that's actually what Varela and the embodied mind people, the inactivists like Evan Thompson, where I think they would find that very. I know Evan Thompson finds it very. At least my understanding from him is that he finds it very compatible with his. So there's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow is relational realism. I'm going to sort of gesture to relational quantum mechanics, the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics, which I think of as not having the same kinds of problems as let's say it differently. I think there's some misunderstanding about what construction is. And I'm not saying that everything is subjective. I'm saying everything is relational. Everything is perspective dependent. That's very different from saying, you have a reality, I have a reality, anybody can have a reality, everything is 100% subjective. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is there's no traditional realism. It is not consistent with how a brain works. And there are other views of relational. There are other philosophical views that are deeply relational that don't have the same problems as. So I guess what I'm saying is that embodiment also has a bunch of jargon. Every single perspective has a bunch of jargon. You just pick the jargon that you're comfortable with. What I'm trying to do is actually show how things are similar or leverage where they're not, if that makes sense.
As soon as you said it's compatible with Evan Thompson and Varela, then I agree that it's not subjectivist anymore. It is relational in the Gibsonian way.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say that Evan just wrote this amazing book with Marcella Glaser and another physicist called The Blind Spot. And this book is amazing. This is an amazing book. And he's basically, what they're talking about is something, I think it's amazing because I agree with it basically, but they just do a great job they do a great job of digging into the history of physics in a way that I just find really compelling, where they're basically talking about how what scientists have done is they create abstractions, which are simplifications. They're fictions because they're useful, and then they believe the fictions and they think that embodied experience is what's false. I just wrote something like that, although I didn't use that language, where the problem in psychology is that people are taking their abstractions like way too seriously, and they're ignoring contextuality and situatedness. So I think it's pretty much the same. It's just, emphasizing different jargon, maybe. Yeah.
Yep, please.
Is there any sort of clever speculation you can do about Freudian defense mechanisms and Freudian slips in terms of predictive processing?
Well, I think there are a number of people who've tried to make a bridge between Freud and predictive processing. Personally, I think that's not my wheelhouse. So I'll have to say I haven't really thought about it too much. I don't think that there are mechanisms. I think Freud was really good at identifying phenomena but then explaining them very badly. But he was really good at something that a lot of us are not so good at, I think, which is in everyday life, he would see something and really be curious about it and sort of highlight it as something to be explained. And then he would come up with, I think, an entirely bad explanation. But the fact is that identifying the phenomena is half the battle, right? And I'll just give you one example, which is psychosexual stages. So the second psychosexual stage, which is, I can't remember, but where you get pleasure from defecating. Anal, the anal stage, yeah. It's super interesting is that if you actually if you strip away all the mechanistic explanation and you just look at what he's talking about, it's actually really consistent with the idea that serotonin, 90% of the serotonin in your body is made in your intestines. And when you have a bowel movement, depending on what's happened in your gut, how the digestion has proceeded, how much serotonin there is, it can feel not exactly pleasant, but it can feel okay, or it can feel very, very, very painful. So he's identifying this feeling that then he comes up with this not plausible and somewhat problematic set of explanations. But he's actually identifying something really interesting, and that is that we now know, which is that 90% of the serotonin in your entire body is made in your intestines. What you eat, how you feed the little buggers in your, the little bacteria in your gut, really has a big effect on your mood and the functioning of your brain. This is actually, it's remarkable and miraculous. And scientists don't understand everything about how this works, but I think we understand that much. And his observations are really consistent with that. And if you just look at all the things he's talked about, I think that's where I find value in him, but in his writing. But defense mechanisms, I don't know that I have anything useful to say there, but other people do. There are other people who've written about that. And if you just look up Carl Friston, he's sometimes is on those papers. He's very very pluralistic in his use of predictive processing. How is that for deflecting your question? I can't answer your question, but I'll just answer something I can. I'll just say something I can't answer and hope that you won't notice.
That was kind of a speculation anyway.
Oh, well, thanks. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
I'm trying to find out to what extent this is a quibble about words and prediction or not prediction. Suppose you say that maybe perception does not cause actions. Perception has a stack of available options, action schema or whatever. And from past experience, you know that those has been proven reliable. So they have a stamp on them, proven reliable, grade 1, 2, 3, or 4. And you just look at the best available option with the best grade, and you choose that. This is based on past performance, not predicting in any way. But it would yield about the same results, wouldn't it?
No, it really wouldn't. Here's why. Because when those incoming signals, when they are being transmitted from neuron to neuron, the prediction signals are already there. So they're not coming in. The neurons, right from V1, 95% of the signals in primary visual cortex come from the other parts of the brain, other parts of the cortex, excuse me. Only 5% come from the thalamus. So when those signals come from your retina to the thalamus, to the cortex, to primary visual cortex, they are meeting prediction signals that are already there. All the feed-forward signals are meeting neuron. When they go to the next neuron, they're meeting feedback signals, prediction signals that are already there. So I just don't think it's plausible what you're saying. I don't think it's just semantic, just like fiddling with words. I really don't. I think it's. I think there is a way. Our friend has left, but I think there is a way to talk about incoming signals constraining the prediction signals of the brain. But I don't think that perception, that the neurons that we would assign the function of perception to have plans in them that they forward onward. I don't see even the anatomy as supporting that view.
Okay. I would like to check that on a later occasion with some results from pattern recognition. But we take it on another occasion.
I will, sure. But I will say this. You can show me anything functional you want. Anything functional you want. You can show me any modeling you want. I will show you the anatomy. And then you have to reconcile. All a model does is it shows you what's plausible. It doesn't show you what's true. Yeah. And there are usually more than one explanation for why the model works the way it does. The best we could say is that it's a question.
For today.
Thank you.